Center for International Policy says Obama has offered Saudi Arabia more than $115 billion in weapons, military equipment and training. Since the Iran nuclear deal, Persian Gulf Arab countries demanded the U.S. alleviate their hissy fit by providing them weapons, political cover, intelligence, as they support extremist ideologies, suppression at home, terrorism elsewhere, and as they bomb Yemen. Obama has been only too happy to bow to this, as have the UK and France, despite their claims of supporting democracy and human rights. Israel, too, is happy with these deals, comfortable in its common ground with these Arab countries over their shared enmity of Iran. That and more in this debate. Let me now introduce our guests. We're joined by former U.S. Senate foreign policy analyst, Mr. James Jatras, who is joining us live from Washington. And we're also joined by independent scholar, Mr. Peter Sinnot, who is joining us live from New York. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining us. Mr. Sinnot, I'll start with you. Obama has offered Saudis more than these $115 billion in weapons, military equipment, training. And this is, of course, the most of any U.S. administration in the 71-year alliance. How do you feel about this?
Well, I'm a little confused on the figure because I was finding 1.15 billion, and that would compares with last year was a little more. The key thing about this projected, and it probably will be approved by the Senate, the key thing is the profile of the weapons. It has changed dramatically since last year. And what you have this year is 130 Abrams main battle tanks. Now, the key thing is to take that number, the 130, and add it to how many Abrams main battle tanks are there already in Saudi Arabia. And you're coming up with a number that is definitely more than 550. 500 tanks is a tank army. And then you have 2 extra regiments. So it has the ability to move on the Saudi peninsula in force on a level that is equivalent to blitzkrieg if it was pointed in any one direction. So it really reflects a major shift in U.S. strategy, and it's related to a shift in global politics and alliances in the region.
Okay, I just wanted to clarify those figures. $115 billion
Saudi Arabia
is since the beginning of Obama's administration in 2009. $1.15 billion is the latest arms deal which has been signed between the Saudis and the U.S. Mr. Jatras, let me get your reaction to this as well. How do you feel about these deals and these offers?
Well, I don't feel good about it. I think Mr. Sinnot is correct that especially this investment in tanks does change the character of the Saudi force structure, and you do have to wonder what country would they be planning to roll their tanks into that they need to build a tank army of this sort. Certainly, I don't see any proximate defensive need for this. I don't see any country that's likely to roll into Saudi Arabia on the ground, and they would need a tank army like this to defend themselves. I think the bigger question I have, though, is the level of corruption that this really points to here in the United States, that in addition to what the Saudis spend on lobbying and PR and all the rest of it, that these arms purchases buy political influence. That means a lot of very powerful corporations with a lot of friends on Capitol Hill, friends in the Pentagon, friends of the administration, are essentially clients for the Saudis, and they will carry water for the Saudis, and that no matter how horrible their human rights record or how much terrorism they support, that they will have people will look the other way and even make excuses for them, and why it's in our interest to really support them.
So, Mr. Sinnot, in a sense, and Mr. Jatras can correct me, but it seems like almost like U.S. politicians and certainly U.S. companies are up for sale, regardless of the other party's human rights, track record, which in this case, obviously, we know the Saudis' track record is quite obvious within their borders and outside.
That's largely true. But, when you look at this, you also have to say to yourself, where has this country, Saudi Arabia, been putting its money? What are its goals? They talked 10 years ago about how they were going to build the world's largest chemical industry, how they were going to build all sorts of things in eastern Saudi Arabia. What this deal says is, they have to expand their army in order to actually service all these vehicles. If you're going to have a 550-plus mainline battle tank group, and then there's other things, you're really you have to, who are you going to train? Are you going to bring in foreigners? Where are they going to get the people? They have to enlarge their military force, certainly 15% in order to do something like this, and probably 20%. So you go back to the idea of education. How have they been meeting their goals? And the answer is they haven't. They're not meeting their goals in education. They're not meeting their goals in social welfare. They're not meeting their goals in a lot of things. And I hate to say this, but it's sort of a truism. This tank was the tank for the 1980s, and I know it's been upgraded. But you know, when you see a deal like this and you're an American, you say, gee, I bet by 2020 there's a totally new model available. So I see this as a very strange move, but it has to be seen in geopolitical terms. I think that this has come on because of the greater alliance now, very recently, between Russia, with Turkey, and even using Iran as a base. I see the region basically in a tremendous antagonism and tension between the forces of Shia Islam and Sunni Islam. And it is Saudi Arabia that wants to be the sword of Sunni Islam. And this is a lot of money to spend and maybe waste. They've wasted it on a lot of things in the last 50 years, and this just may be another. But you cannot buy those tanks without having a much larger army. And one of the small figures that no one will ever concentrate on is that including in that deal are 20 tank recovery vehicles. What this means is that when you go into an actual combat conditions and tanks are knocked out, tanks are injured, when you have to have tank recovery units in order to bring them back for repairs. And to put such a emphasis on tank recovery units it says to me that they're really geared for a very active and mobile tank force and a tank-based army.
Okay, so Mr. Jatras, as Mr. Sinnot there said, certainly the geopolitical situation must have influenced, obviously, these offers of arms and training, et cetera, from the United States to the Saudis, and the Saudis seem to be playing ball with this as well, buying up a large amount of these arms. How do you judge their need for such arms, even with the geopolitical situation being the way it is?
Again, I don't disagree with the larger picture that Mr. Sinnot paints. I would point out that this is not just something recent because of developments between Russia and Iran and the uncertain direction of where Turkey is going right now. Let's remember that the Saudis have seen themselves as the champion of not only Sunni Islam, but removing secular states in order to create states that are more in line with the Wahhabist ideology of Saudi Arabia. And I would add to that the support for various terrorist groups around the world that have essentially the same ideology. Let's remember, the Syrian war has been going on for 5 years now, where the Saudis have been the main bankroller of all these various jihadist groups, mostly foreigners going into Syria to try to overthrow the secular government of Syria. So I don't think it's a reactive thing on the part of Saudi Arabia, although recent developments with regard to Turkey and Iran and Russia and so forth may have given greater impetus to it. But I think for a long time the Saudis have seen their mission in the world, and maybe they even seen this as essential to the legitimacy of the regime internally, which after all this is a private state owned by a family, that their legitimacy is based on being the visible champion for this very radical, very violent ideology of Wahhabism.
Okay, gentlemen, I just want to take a quick time out. Our viewers have been taking part in this conversation as well online. Let's listen to their comments and we'll be right back.
I find it interesting that while a tiny country like Cuba offers doctors and educators to the world, the U.S. sells arms and training to those it orders to destabilize countries on its behalf. Of course, they also offer bombings, invasions, coups, and proxy wars. The arming of Saudi Arabia by the U.S. is to destabilize the Middle East, and Yemen is no exemption. Saudi puppets are pawns on a chessboard for the U.S. Saudi monarch cannot match Iran, and the U.S. is aware of this fact. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is beginning to weaken, and Washington cannot allow this strategic ally to weaken. Preparing them for the War of Armageddon. This kingdom was created by them to do so. What's new? They want to empty Saudi pockets before toppling them.
Just some of your comments on this topic. Mr. Sinnot, I'm wondering, as Mr. Jatras there mentioned right before we went to those comments, the Saudis do export an extreme ideology, do they not, to a lot of regional countries, be it places like Syria and Iraq, of course, but even in countries like Pakistan, for a very long time, they've been exporting their extremist ideology, i.e. Wahhabism, to those countries. So I'm wondering, why then arm such a country when it is doing such harm, essentially, to a lot of the regional countries?
I think there is a real weakness in the U.S. structure of Congress and politics and lobbies. This is really the outgrowth of something that was really a post-World War II phenomenon, the incredible growth of lobbying groups and their power. There really is no logical reason to have a country build a tank army of some 500 to 550 main battle tanks modern. There's so many weird things about this. I don't see how they can have a volunteer army that can do this. I don't see how they can do this without bringing in foreigners to man some of these tanks and such. So they are building an army, and they have projections for an air force that they really aren't able to man. And they don't have this, they haven't shown in the war against Yemen their ability to fly these planes with accuracy. So this is a situation of a kingdom with a lot of expensive, very high-powered war toys that doesn't really use them in a way that they were meant to be used when sold by the U.S. government. Now, again, the profile is the key thing. Last year, they focused on buying the weapons for the planes, the bombs and things. The profile of what they're spending their money on is changing each year. And I would project that next year their focus will be on fighting armored personnel carriers, fighting vehicles. And if they do that, they will have completed the ability to build a very large-scale mobile army. Again, where are they going to get the people for this army? They don't have the personnel now that are trained for this. So they're buying something. It's like buying a car without knowing how to drive. I think this is an incredible, crazy waste of money, but it has to have a goal behind it. When you're talking about something that can be formed into a tank army, you're talking about something that can be overwhelming at any point on the Saudi Peninsula.
Right, so Mr. Jatras, this obviously, when we talk about the fact that the United States is providing such a country with so many arms, there obviously, the usual hypocrisy comes up then, doesn't it? Talk about human rights, talk about democracy, et cetera, all this conversation comes up. Even if we accept the lobbying issue, certainly there must be a strong lobby which is backing all of this in the United States. But how does one sell this then to the American people, or are the American people just not aware that there's this major hypocritical stance going on?
I don't think most Americans are aware of this. Most Americans don't know much about the outside world. You would be shocked about how poor our evening news broadcasts are on giving you real information or balanced information about what's going on in the world. You can watch an entire half-hour news program sometimes. There's not a single story about an event outside the United States, and if one is covered, it's just one little blip of what the Pentagon announced today. If you asked most Americans where Saudi Arabia was, they wouldn't know. They certainly would not know where Yemen is. They would not know what Saudi Arabia is doing in Yemen. They would not know about the civilian carnage that's being inflicted with American weapons. Frankly, the public doesn't need to know or understand because they don't have a voice in the matter. The people on Capitol Hill, the people at the Pentagon, and so forth, as I say, not only the lobbying goes on, but the purchase of weapons itself is an important point of influence because that money talks as well. I suppose if Iran were allowed to buy American weapons, a lot of people in Washington suddenly would start loving Iran too.
But Mr. Sinnot, then a lot of this has a cost, though, on the United States, doesn't it? A, it hurts its image, obviously, and the image of the West in general, because it's also the UK and France who are just selling arms to Saudi Arabia and other dictatorships in this region. So I'm wondering, the image obviously is hurt, and secondly, then you have blowback because these countries such as Saudi Arabia are supporting terrorism in many countries such as Syria and Iraq, and that then carries over at some point into Western countries. So why not stop this crazy policy?
Well, it's amazing how Saudi Arabia has taken on this special relationship, because there is a very little Americans. There was no sense of tourism. They're not interested in that. There hasn't really been any sense of progress in rights over decades. So you're really Saudi Arabia remains in a certain profile as a country that's very closed to outsiders, especially to non-Muslims or to non-Sunni Muslims. It's a country that has really staked its relationship on its role in being the guarantor of stability in oil. And it has made that role into a major role. But be that as it may, the world is changing, and the energy mix is changing. We are really seeing a shift towards natural gas. We are seeing a sense of the U.S. being less dependent on Saudi oil, yet it still sees and wants to work with Saudi Arabia that they can guarantee oil stability, oil supply stability in the world. I can't come to any other conclusion that this is the critical role that Saudi Arabia is seen as playing, and it's the role the United States sees as the most important aspect of the relationship.
Okay, Mr. Jatras, I want to get your take, of course, on the factor that we may be moving away from oil, obviously, but I also want to throw this in there, that Israel, the United States says it has not objected to these offers of these arms and training to the Saudis. We would imagine that at some point in the past the Israelis would have objected, but it seems now that the Israelis and Saudis have a common enemy now, and that is the perceived enemy of the Islamic Republic of Iran, of course, since the nuclear deal. So in a sense, how do you feel about that? Is Israel essentially giving a green light to these Saudis to do as they wish as well?
I think they are. The Israelis have an interesting and I think a not entirely sound pattern of really focusing on what they perceive to be enemy number one today, and not being so concerned about what may replace that enemy if you take care of today's enemy. I can remember, for example, when Saddam Hussein is Israel's big enemy, and of course people who were pro-Israeli were very keen on supporting the Gulf War against Saddam Hussein, seemingly not understanding that if you remove Saddam Hussein, you're going to see a vast expansion of Iran's regional influence into a majority Shiite country. You saw the same thing even in the rise of Hezbollah and Hamas, which the Israelis were not real worried about because they saw them as a thorn against the Palestine Liberation Organization, which they considered the main enemy at the time. Well, look what they're facing now. It wasn't not necessarily an improvement of their situation. So right now, their big focus is Iran is the great evil enemy, and even though at least the Israelis I talk to don't like the Saudis, there seems to be a consensus that better the Saudis today than the Iranians, and then once we take care of the Iranian threat, then we can worry about the Saudis. That may not be a good idea.
Well, we'll leave it there as our final point. But gentlemen, of course, we do appreciate both your contributions to this debate. That was former U.S. Senate foreign policy analyst, Mr. James Jatras, who had been speaking to us live from Washington. And we were also joined by independent scholar, Mr. Peter Sinnot, who had been speaking to us live from New York. And of course, viewers, we appreciate your insights as posted on our social media. And of course, for watching. Until next time, good night.